Hello, and welcome to another episode of Empowerment and Illness. I'm Gwen, your host. I want to discuss some of the most difficult but important conversations about what it's like to live with a chronic illness or autoimmune disease. This episode is about the emotional toll of it all: depression, anxiety, grief, and loneliness. These are struggles that so many of us face but rarely feel comfortable talking about it. My hope today is to bring those feelings out of the shadows and into the light, to show you that you are not alone, and to remind you that your emotions are valid, no matter how messy or heavy they may feel. There are no guests today, no expert, just me and you sharing this moment. Let's begin. Depression. It's such a heavy word, isn't it? And when you live with a chronic illness, it's not just something you experience in fleeting moments. It can become a constant, unwelcome companion. I want to talk about what depression feels like when you're living with a condition that just doesn't go away. It's not just sadness. It's not just feeling down. It's this unshakable heaviness that seeps into every corner of your life. Imagine waking up already exhausted from a night of tossing and turning, and the first thought that crosses your mind is, I can't do this today. Not because you're lazy or unmotivated, but because the weight of your illness and everything it's taken from you feels insurmountable. Depression can steal the color of your world. Things you used to love, dancing, painting, hiking, whatever it may be, feels meaningless now. You want to care. You try to care, but the spark just isn't there anymore. And then there's the guilt. Oh, the guilt. It's relentless. You feel guilty for not doing enough, guilty for canceling plans, guilty for leaning on your partner or your family member one too many times. Guilty because deep down, you wonder if you're just not enough or strong enough to handle it better. And society doesn't help, does it? You hear people say, stay positive, or at least you're alive, as if gratitude can magically cure the pain you carry. But depression isn't a choice. It's a fog that creeps in and tells you lies about yourself, that you're not enough, that you'll never be enough, that your illness defines you. And it's exhausting, isn't it? Fighting the fog every single day. I've had days where just brushing my teeth felt like climbing a mountain. Days where I wanted to cry, but couldn't find the tears because I felt so numb. And yet, I show up anyway. Maybe not the way I wanted to, but I show up. If this sounds familiar, I want you to know you're not weak, you're not failing, you're human. Living with a chronic illness is hard enough without the added weight of depression. And if you're carrying that weight, I see you. One thing that's helped me on my hardest days is giving myself permission to feel, to sit with my sadness, to acknowledge it, instead of fighting it. Sometimes I write things down, everything I'm feeling, from every thought, every fear, just to get it out of my head. Other times, I'm simply resting without guilt, because resting, my friend, is not giving up, it's recharging. And if you take away anything, let it be this: you are not alone. Depression lies to you. It tells you no one understands, that no one cares. But I'm here to tell you that's not true. I care. And I'm proud of you for holding on, even when it feels impossible. Anxiety. It's that gnawing sensation in the pit of your stomach, that racing heartbeat you can't control, that constant sense of dread you can't explain. For so many of us living with chronic illness, anxiety isn't just occasional, it's a constant shadow. You know, before I got sick, I thought I understood anxiety. I'd get nervous before meeting new people or feel uneasy about a difficult conversation. But chronic illness anxiety, That's something else entirely. It's waking up every morning wondering, what is my body going to do to me today? Will this be the day a flare hits out of nowhere? Will I have to cancel plans again? And let's not even start on the what ifs. What if this medication stops working? What if my doctor dismisses me again? What if I lose my job because I can't keep up? What if my marriage fails because he's tired of dealing with me? And it's not just the big things either. It's the small, everyday moments like standing in the grocery store, trying to decide if you should spend money on a supplement that might help or save it for the next month's copay. Or sitting in the waiting room at yet another doctor's appointment, your mind racing with every possible scenario, none of them good. Anxiety for me feels like this relentless voice in my head, constantly whispering, "You're not good enough. You're not prepared. You're failing." It's exhausting. But what makes anxiety so cruel is how it intertwines with your illness. The physical symptoms of anxiety, racing heart, tight chest, shallow breathing, they mimic the symptoms of so many chronic conditions. So now, not only are you anxious, but you're also wondering if this is the start of something worse. I've had days where the anxiety feels so overwhelming that I can't focus on anything else. My mind jumps from one fear to the next like a pinball machine. And no matter how much I try to calm myself down, it's like my body doesn't believe me. And let's be honest, anxiety doesn't just affect you. It affects your relationships. Maybe you've snapped at a loved one because you were so overwhelmed by your own thoughts. Or maybe you've avoided certain conversations because you were too afraid of what the outcome may be. It isolates you, doesn't it? If you're listening to this and thinking, "Hey, that's me," I want you to know it's okay. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. It's okay to be scared. You're not weak. You're human. One thing I've found helpful is grounding myself when the anxiety feels like it's spiraling out of control. That means literally planting my feet on the floor and reminding myself of where I am. I'll say things like, right now, I'm sitting in my chair. I can feel my feet on the ground. I can hear the sound of my breath. It might sound simple, but it's a way of pulling myself out of what ifs and back into the right now. Another thing that helps is giving myself permission to pause, to take a moment to breathe, even if it feels like the world is demanding I keep going. Because the truth is, the world can wait. Your health, both physical and mental, is more important. And please, if you're drowning in anxiety, don't hesitate to reach out for help. Whether that's talking to a friend, finding a support group, or working with a therapist, you don't have to face this alone. Anxiety thrives on fear and isolation. But when you speak your fears aloud, when you share your struggles, anxiety starts to lose its power. Grief. It's not a word we often associate with chronic illness, but it should be. Grief is such a deep part of this experience, and yet so few people talk about it. When most people hear the word grief, they think of losing a loved one. And while that's true, grief is so much more than that. For those of us living with chronic illness, grief is about losing part of ourselves. It's grieving the person you were before your diagnosis. The person who could stay out late with friends, who didn't have to check their symptoms or energy level before making plans. It's mourning the dreams you had for your life, the career you worked so hard for, the adventures you thought you'd take, the future you imagined. Grief felt like this deep, aching sadness that I couldn't escape. I remember sitting in my car one afternoon, staring out the window and thinking, this is not how my life was supposed to be. And that thought, just that one thought, opened the floodgates. And the thing about grief is that it doesn't follow a straight line. It's not like you feel it once and then move on. It comes in waves. Some days you feel okay, maybe even hopeful. And then out of nowhere, A wave of grief hits you and you're drowning all over again. Maybe it's triggered by something small, like seeing a social media post of a friend hiking a trail you used to love. Or maybe it's something big, like having to quit a job you once adored because your body just couldn't keep up anymore. What makes grief so heavy is that it's often invisible to others. People don't see the dreams you've had to let go of. They don't see the countless little losses, like not being able to enjoy favorite food because it triggers a flare, or missing out on family gatherings because you're too fatigued to get out of bed. And because they don't see it, they don't always understand it. Grief can also feel incredibly lonely. You may feel like no one understands what you're going through. And even if you try to explain it, the words never seem to fully capture the depth of what you've lost. But here's what I want you to know. Your grief is valid. It doesn't matter if other people don't understand it. You're allowed to grieve the life you had, the person you were, the things you lost. One of the hardest part of grief was letting myself feel it. I was so afraid that if I gave in to the sadness, it will swallow me whole. But what I've learned is that grief doesn't go away just because you ignore it. In fact, the more you try to push it down, the heavier it becomes. So if you're feeling grief right now, let it out. Cry if you need to. Write about it. Scream. Cuss. Talk to someone who will listen without judgment. Grief isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of love for the life you've had to leave behind. And as heavy as grief is, it can also be a teacher. It's taught me to appreciate the little moments of joy that still exist in my life. It's shown me how strong I am, even when I feel broken. And it reminded me that healing isn't about going back to who you were. It's about finding a way forward. If you're listening to this and grieving right now, I want you to know that you're not alone. Your grief is valid, and it's okay to take your time with it. There's no timeline for healing, and there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And maybe, with time, you'll find that grief isn't just about loss. It's about love. Love for the person you were, love for the life you've lived, and love for the strength that carries you through this moment. Let's talk about loneliness. It's a feeling that creeps in quietly and settles deep inside you, especially when you're living with a chronic illness. Loneliness isn't just about being alone. In fact, you could be surrounded by people, family, friends, coworkers, and still feel utterly isolated. Why? Because chronic illness creates a barrier that's hard for others to understand. It's the missed gatherings because your body simply couldn't handle the day. It's the endless cancellation, the text messages that goes unanswered because you're too drained to reply. And after a while, people stop asking. They stop inviting. They don't mean to hurt you, but their lives move on while you feel stuck, watching from the sideline. Loneliness for me felt like standing in the middle of a crowded room and screaming, but no one even looked up. I wanted so badly for someone to notice, to ask me how I'm really doing. Not just a polite way, how are you, but a genuine, how are you holding up? But those questions rarely came. And then there's the unique loneliness that comes with an invisible illness. When people can't see what's wrong, they don't understand why you're struggling. They may say things like, but you don't look sick, or you seemed fine yesterday. And with every dismissive comment, you feel more and more unseen, more disconnected. What makes loneliness even harder is how it feeds into everything else. It amplifies the depression. It heightens the anxiety. It compounds the grief. And after a while, you start to wonder if you're the problem, if maybe you're just too much for people to handle. But let me tell you something. You are not too much. You are not a burden. You are someone navigating an incredibly difficult path. And if the people around you can't see that, it says more about them than it does you. Now, I won't pretend that I have all the answers for overcoming loneliness, but I want to share a few tips that I've used to kind of help me get through it. First, I had to learn to be honest about what I needed. It's not easy, I know that, but sometimes people don't show up for us because they don't know how. They don't know what to say or what to do. So I started telling my close friends things like, I don't need advice. I just need someone to listen. Or, I'd love if you could just sit with me for a while. I don't want to be alone today. Second, I found connections in places I didn't expect. Social media became a lifeline for me. There's something incredibly powerful about talking to people who get it, who understand the exhaustion, the fear, the frustration, because you're living it too. If you're listening to this and you feel isolated, I encourage you to seek out social media and find your community. They're out there, and they can be a source of incredible comfort. Third, I had to learn to be kind to myself. Loneliness often comes with a lot of self-blame. I tell myself things like, if I weren't sick, I would be able to go out more. If I could just keep up, people wouldn't leave. But those thoughts are lies. The truth is, living with a chronic illness is isolating. Not because you're flawed, but because our society isn't built to support people like us. And finally, I had to remind myself that loneliness, like everything else, comes in waves. There are days when it feels unbearable, when the silence is deafening. But there are also days when connection feels possible, when a kind word, a thoughtful message, or even a shared smile reminds you that you're not as alone as you feel. If you're feeling lonely right now, I see you. I feel what you're feeling, and you're not alone, not in this moment, not ever. Loneliness can feel all-encompassing, but it doesn't define you. You are more than the isolation you're feeling. You are worthy of love, connection, and understanding. And I hope, in some small way, this moment we're sharing right now reminds you that someone out there is rooting for you. That someone is me. Before we leave, I would like to close with a special portion of the show I call Healing Heartbeats. This is where we allow ourselves to wallow in sorrow. Give yourself 3 minutes to laugh, cry, scream, cuss, or just sit in silence. Whatever you need to do to feel it, do it. Let the depression in for only 3 minutes. Once you reach 3 minutes, compartmentalize it and get back to living. This is a rinse and repeat behavior. You cannot let depression take over because when it does, it will not let go. When someone passes away, they have the day they were born and the day they passed away. There is a dash in the middle. It's not a long line, it's a short dash. That dash represents your life. Go live in spite of having a chronic illness. Don't let your condition stop you. Thank you for sharing this time with me today. If you made it this far, I want you to pause for a moment and recognize just how strong you are. You've carried so much depression, anxiety, grief, loneliness, and yet, here you are still holding on. That's not easy, and it's something to be proud of. Living with a chronic illness or autoimmune disease is not just a physical battle. It's an emotional and mental one too. And while the weight of it all can feel unbearable at times, I want you to remember this. You are not your illness. You are not your worst days. You are so much more than the pain, the fear, and the sadness. I hope today's conversation reminded you that it's okay to feel everything that you're feeling. It's okay to cry, to grieve, to scream at the universe if you need to. But it's also okay to hope, to laugh, to find joy in the small moments. Because even on the hardest days, there is still beauty to be found. As you go forward, I want you to carry this with you. You are not alone. Not in your depression, not in your anxiety, not in your grief or your loneliness. Someone out there, someone, maybe it's me, maybe it's the person listening to this podcast at the same time as you, is walking a similar path. And together, even in our solitude, we create a community of resilience. Thank you for letting me share my heart with you today. If this episode spoke to you, please take a moment to reflect on what you've heard and what it means for you. And if you feel like sharing your thoughts or experiences, know that I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take it one breath, one moment, one step at a time. You are stronger than you know, and you are so deeply loved. Remember, you have the strength, the heart, and the support to continue your journey. Be safe.